안녕하십니까? 제17회 제주 포럼에 참석해 주신 여러분 반갑습니다. 지금부터 전 세계 인도주의 활동과 HDP 인도적 지원 개발 평화 넥서스 세션을 시작하겠습니다. 본 행사는 동시 통역이 제공되며 통역을 원하시는 분들께서는 자리에 놓여 있는 수신기를 착용하시기 바랍니다. 한국어 채널은 5번, 영어는 6번입니다. 그러면 세션의 진행을 맡아주실 좌장님을 소개해 드리겠습니다. 좌장님은 국제개발협력민간협의회의 조대식 사무총장님이십니다.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 17th Jeju Forum. Thank you for joining us today for Global Humanitarian Action and the HDP Nexus. Simultaneous interpretation is available for this session. For service in Korean, set your device on channel 5. For English, select channel 6. Now, I would like to hand over the stage to Mr. Jo Dae-shik, who will moderate this session. Everyone, please welcome Mr. Jo.
네, 여러분 안녕하세요.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Dae-shik Jo, Secretary General of KCOC. I will be a moderator for this session. The aim of this session is to first understand and then to discuss the global humanitarian crisis facing today. I believe that there's three primary factors affecting the root cause of this global humanitarian crisis. And I think it can be summarized as three C's. The first, climate change. The second, COVID pandemic. And the number 3C is conflict, such as war in Ukraine. I think to address these three major challenges, today we will be inviting 4 distinguished panels who will share their perspective on respective areas of their expertise. Now let me introduce the panel members. Ms. Corinne Fleischer, WFP Regional Director of MENA and Central Europe. And Professor Lee Yang-hee from Sungkyunkwan University. And Ambassador Oh Jun, President of Save the Children Korea. Ambassador Jenny Hyun Kim, Ambassador for Climate Change in the Republic of Korea, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Today, each member will be given 7 minutes for a presentation, followed by discussion and Q&A. Our first panelist is Ms. Corinne Fleischer. She is the Regional Director of the World Food Programme's Regional Bureau for Middle East, Northern Africa, and East Europe. She is also in charge of the WFP's Ukraine operation. She has worked in key WFP divisions and has diverse experience across many sectors and functions of humanitarian assistance, including emergency coordination, supply chain, including logistics. She will share humanitarian response in some of the world's major conflict zones and how the role of WFP in contributing toward peace in an unprecedented food crisis around the world. Ms. Fleischer, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ambassador and Secretary General Jo. Thank you so much. You know, at lunch, we just discussed about the culture, the food culture of Korea coming out of hunger and how Korea has come from being hungry to being a donor to those who are hungry. And WFP is very, very proud to have been part of that success story of Korea with having projects in Korea at the time. But unfortunately, the world is going in a completely different direction. And let me give you a few examples. I was recently in Syria meeting a mother of 3 children. She told me under tears that she is feeding her children only bread and tea because she has nothing else left. And she cried and she said, had I known where this is going, I would not have had my children. I would have spared them this situation. For a mother to say this is hard. Syria has gone in 11 years. Food prices in Syria in 11 years of conflict have gone up 100 times, not 100%, 100 times, and salaries have not followed suit. Think of Yemen. Yemen, 7 years of conflict, and 16 million people are hungry. That is like a line of hungry people from Sana'a, the capital of Yemen, to Seoul and back. Think of Lebanon, 3 years. Food prices have gone through the roof because of the crisis, and now 50% of the Lebanese people are hungry. They used to be actually called as the Switzerland of the Middle East. So as you said, Secretary Joe, the CCC has ended lives, destroyed livelihoods, and crushed hopes of young people. And that was before Ukraine. In Ukraine, the World Food Programme was not present when the war started, because we are not present when we are not needed in a country. But we had come back, built from scratch, now feeding 4 million people in Ukraine, where 6 million people are out as refugees, 7 million people are inside, displaced, 5 million jobs have been lost, and many houses destroyed. The impact of Ukraine on food prices has been dramatic, and it's been spoken about in this conference. What has happened is the number of people who need assistance in the world, food assistance, has gone from 135 million before COVID to 276 million after COVID, and now 345 million people that cannot survive without having food assistance. The grain deal that has been brokered by the Turkey and the UN, and now food coming out of Ukraine, has probably been the best news in a long time in this world. But unfortunately, while prices have gone down on the international market, they're not in the national markets because of weak currencies, and especially in the Middle East, food is imported very, very much because they don't produce much. And so it hasn't had an effect. Inflation is huge and prices remain very high, and that leads to people not putting food on the table, governments not being able to contain their subsidies as they used to. And WFP, our costs have gone up so much that in many places, our rations are now at half. A very, very bleak situation. Well, that leads to civil unrest, conflict, mass migration, as we have seen 11 years ago. And now this happened, Ukraine, and 6 months later, Pakistan floods happened. And Ambassador Kim will talk about this. But note that 80% of the food in this world is produced by smallholder farmers. And climate crisis destructs smallholder farmers' livelihoods. They migrate because of soaring costs on the farms, because of water not being available and crops failing. They go to the cities, and who will produce the food in future? So hunger drives conflict, and conflict feeds hunger. And you add climate crisis and water scarcity to this, so climate crisis feeds hunger and feeds conflict. And WFP is here in the world feeding 140 million people, and we are the social safety net for many, many places and many countries where governments are unable to provide that social safety net, and that gives stability. It is well known in many reports and evaluations that the large-scale food assistance that WFP provides brings conflicts down, stabilizes communities. And so the Peace Prize, the Nobel Peace Prize that was awarded to the World Food Programme in 2020 is a recognition that hunger and conflict are very, very closely linked. And also a recognition of WFP's fight against hunger, but also a responsibility that we need to continue to fight hunger worldwide. And we feel that very, very strongly when we are at distribution sites across the world where people come to us pleading to get on our lists, but we can't help them because we don't have the funds with the increasing costs. So more than ever, the world must come together to fight hunger. And it's more and more interlinked. Climate crisis, conflict, and hunger. And so we must work closer together. And this forum is an absolute perfect moment to create these linkages for a better world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Fleischer. And thank you for sharing your the numbers, especially it's quite striking numbers. You gave us 100 times, not 100% in Syria, because Syria, the food prices in Syria, maybe this number is so striking to me because I was in neighboring country. I was in Libya 11 years ago when the civil war broke out in Syria and Libya and the neighboring countries. And I have never, at that time, I have never expected this civil war will last more than 10 years. I thought about it would end maybe 1 or 2 years, but I didn't really understand at the time. So you gave us a very good numbers, specific numbers of this, showing this correlation between conflict and hunger. Thank you so much. And our next panelist is Professor Lee Yang-hee. She is founder of the International Children's Human Rights Center, and she has more than 17 years of experience in the human rights sectors and dedicated a career for the protection of children's rights as a guiding force in the drafting and adoption of the optional protocol to the CRC, which is a Convention on the Rights of the Child on a communications procedure. Professor Lee, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. We are witnessing a very different world these days. Crises such as conflict, disasters, and pandemics are protracted and have become more and more complex. Before, when we talked about disasters, we put them in two different categories: natural disasters and man-made disasters. Unfortunately, what we used to call natural disasters are actually the direct result of human behavior, which contributes to climate change. In addition, conflict, which is definitely man-made, also has linkages to the climate. So we can say that the multitude crises that we are experiencing today are direct results of irresponsible, reckless human behavior. Reckless human behavior stems from disregard of human rights. Discussions about the humanitarian development and peace nexus must include human rights as the linchpin. The UN Charter and the UDHR laid the framework for the inclusion of human rights into the HDP nexus discussion. The international community is facing increasingly complex and protracted crises. These include massive humanitarian consequences of conflicts and disasters exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. 3 years of the COVID-19 pandemic has escalated humanitarian needs, and the situation has become even more complex in that we already have protracted conflict and natural disasters caused by the effects of global climate crisis. crisis response have become increasingly more longer term. Most major humanitarian crises are conflict-related, and 2/3 are reported to go on for years. In 2017, the number of recorded and armed conflicts reached its highest number in almost 30 years. Conflicts are also longer lasting, from 9.6 years in the 70s to an average of 26.7 years in 2014, with high possibility of returning to conflict. We have recently witnessed Armenia and Azerbaijan returning to conflict in these past few days. At the end of 2000, this is further seen by related migration and poverty trends. At the end of 2018, forced global displacement hit record highs, reaching 70.8 million internally displaced persons, refugees, and asylum seekers, double the number from 20 years ago. According to the United Nations Global Humanitarian Overview, the number of people in need has increased nearly fourfold over the past decade, from 62 million in 2012 to an expected 274 in 2022. This is where the HDP Nexus comes in. It is a new approach in order to transform the way that humanitarian development and peace activities are planned, financed, and implemented to actively meet needs while reducing risk and building resilience. Of course, the issue with funding must be resolved in order for this new approach to become cohesive and effective. Funding is tied to either humanitarian, development, or peace-building activities. So there is little funding, especially for the Nexus programming. Moreover, the current silo-style system of operation must also change. By nature of how different mandates are currently set up, transformation into a shared, collaborative, and joint mandate system should be considered. In so doing, a rights-based approach would be the shortcut to this crucial transformation. Everybody asks this question: why is human rights important? What are human rights? Human rights are basic rights that we are simply given. We are born with these rights just because of the nature that we are born as human beings. I won't go into the core characteristics of human rights. The international community has been described as being in a state of crisis management in recent years, instead of being more proactively addressing the root causes. It has not been sufficiently supporting the capacities and institutions required for sustainable peace and development. We are now seeing more emphasis on the need to focus on preventing crises and addressing the cause of the conflict, which is a very welcome sign. I'd like to share with you what has happened in the past 2 years in a neighboring country, not close neighboring country, but as my mandate, I was a mandate holder, I was a special rapporteur on the human rights situation of Myanmar for 6 years. On February 1st of 2021, the military in Myanmar attempted a coup. I say attempted a coup. The coup hasn't started. They have not succeeded. The resistance democratic movement is holding ground. Myanmar is a clear example of when drivers of conflict have gone enjoying impunity for decades. Flagrant human rights abuses and violations have created a colossal humanitarian crisis of this century, of the 21st century. The world witnessed in 2016 and 2017 the military drive out more than 700,000 Rohingya into Bangladesh, killing more than 9,000, some reports say more than 24,000, when they committed genocide against the Rohingya. There are currently more than 1 million refugees in Cox's Bazar of Bangladesh. This same military had ruled over Myanmar for over 6 decades. But not accepting the 2020 elections, the military staged another coup on the 1st of February of 2021. Since then, the military has weaponized the COVID-19 pandemic, burned down houses, bombed schools, churches, hospitals, and civilian homes. Moreover, arrested tens of thousands of innocent civilians, brutally tortured and killed thousands, including children, women, and the elderly. What is unacceptable is the fact that the military is completely wiping out an entire generation. Over 1,400 people have been arrested, and at least 274 remain behind bars. I'm going to talk about, since the coup, more than 362 children between the ages of 3 months and 17 years old have been arrested. At least 7.8 million children are deprived of the right to education because of the conflict, and another 33,000 are at the risk of dying because from treatable diseases, because they never had their vaccine cycle this year. Children have been stabbed, tortured, held, abducted, held as hostages to get to their parents. Myanmar provides a clear example of what protection of human rights means in the HDP nexus and the way forward. The current crisis is resulting not only in physical and personal destruction, but is on track to wiping out an entire generation of people, namely children. For a nexus of an HDP to work, it must put people at the center of the work of the different entities at play. By this, I mean people and their human rights. I hope during our discussion, I'll be able to share more of what this HDP nexus in programming and planning can mean into real-life situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Lee. I think you have highlighted the importance of human rights in case of Myanmar, and also the importance of the approach, Nexus approach. I believe Nexus approach seems to me as a holistic approach in a sense. And the distinction between two disasters is also, man-made disaster and natural disaster. I think this is something that we have to remind every time we have seen any kind of disaster, that we have to distinguish between these two. And so thank you so much for for sharing your insight. And our next panel member is Ambassador Jun-Oh, President of Save the Children Korea, and he's also a board member of Save the Children International. Previously, he was the Republic of Korea's ambassador and permanent representative to the United Nations in New York from 2013 to 16. During this time, he also served as the 71st President of Economic and Social Council, and as president of the Conference of State Parties to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in 2015 and 16. Ambassador Oh will share his views and expertise on the direction of the international community to intervene in humanitarian crisis. Ambassador Oh, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Joe. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Jeju Forum and WFP for putting up this session on global humanitarian action, which I think is very timely. By way of emphasizing the importance of the HDP nexus, I would like to break it down and kind of talk a little bit about each of the three nexuses, three bilateral nexuses instead of trilateral nexus, meaning humanitarian peace, development peace, and humanitarian development. First, for the humanitarian peace nexus, I like to start with a story of a tragic incident that happened in Myanmar last year. Professor Lee has already kindly explained the humanitarian situation in Myanmar. And what happened on the eve of Christmas last year, on December 24, was that 2 staff members of Save the Children there were killed, along with dozens of civilians on their way back to office after working on a humanitarian response in eastern Myanmar. On the highway, the military forced these people out from their cars, arrested some, and killed many. The military regime claimed those who died were suspected terrorists. Save the Children has been working in Myanmar since 1995, providing humanitarian assistance and child protection through more than 900 staff across the country. Unfortunately, the attack on Save the Children staffers in Myanmar is not an isolated instance. According to the Aid Worker Security Report, last year alone, there were 267 reported attacks, resulting in 117 kidnapped and 140 killed. In many crises today, which are often protracted and multifaceted, indiscriminate military attacks are not only putting up obstacles to humanitarian activities, but also exposing humanitarian aid workers to greater dangers. This is happening in all conflict areas, including Syria, Yemen, and Ukraine. As such, without a certain level of peace restored, humanitarian work is becoming increasingly difficult. Next, the nexus between development and peace is also often highlighted in the era of sustainable development. In fact, as you all know, one of the important characteristics of the SDGs is the linkage of development and peace. Goal 16, SDG 16, clearly reflects this nexus, emphasizing the importance of peaceful society, access to justice, and the rule of law in achieving sustainable development. This is manifest particularly in conflict-affected countries where opportunities for development are lost as both government and people are struggling for survival. Not only that, very often conflict and unrest can reverse gains made in development. This is why when a country is in conflict, we need to join force to help it get out of the conflict. And when a country is emerging from conflict, we need to assist it to rebuild its nation and reconstruct its economy. For this purpose, the United Nations established the Peace Building Commission, or PBC, in 2006. The PBC works with the Security Council and ECOSOC, as its mandate lies where the works of the two councils meet. The UN's work focuses on helping post-conflict countries move forward to sustainable development and preventing them from sliding back. Post-conflict countries face complex challenges. Above all, they should address the immediate challenges of peace and security. And to make the peace durable, they should tackle the root causes of conflict. At the same time, they need to restore their social and economic structure through institution building and human resources development. Last but not least, the nexus between humanitarian assistance and development. In the past, humanitarian relief was able to focus only on a humanitarian crisis, usually providing short-term help until the long-term help by government and other institutions replaces it. But now that the crises are often protracted and multifaceted, the boundary between humanitarian aid and development assistance is getting increasingly blurred. For example, WFP's work to provide emergency food relief needs to bear in mind longer-term food security as well. From the perspectives of a recipient country, for successful transition from an emergency to a more sustainable stage, it is very important to use external assistance effectively to make it contribute more to economic and social reconstruction. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have to correct the title of Ambassador Oh. He is not a president, but now board chair of the Save the Children Korea. I think Ambassador Oh has given us some sense of the correlation between this nexus between these two dimensions. One is nexus between development and peace, and the other one is nexus between humanitarian assistance and development. And this, I think there's a lot of topics that we can have a discussion in the Q&A session after this presentation. And our next speaker is Ambassador Hyo-eun Kim. She is Ambassador for Climate Change for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She also served as the section head of the World Trade Organization and the Climate Change and Environment section of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She also works at the GGGI Global Green Growth Institute, where she was responsible for climate change and support green growth in 35 developing countries. Ambassador Kim, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador Cho. First of all, just like previous speakers, I would like to thank to the WFP, World Food Program, for organizing this important session. As we witness the global crisis, multiple global crises, including humanitarian crisis, conflicts, and natural disasters, and the destruction of supply chain as well, I think this session is very, very relevant. When you see the title of this session, which is about humanitarian development and peace nexus, there is no word of climate change. However, I would like to emphasize that climate change is very, very relevant with the topic of this session, because climate change is more becoming a main cause of humanitarian crisis, development challenge, and armed conflicts. So why climate change is a critical factor for integration in humanitarian actions, development operations, and peacekeeping and peace-building process. That's the main point I would like to present. So now the world is at the stage of climate catastrophe, I would rather say. So personally, I don't like the term of climate change. When you say about climate change, the term is slightly misleading because it's just a change. It sounds you still have a time. It sounds you are still fine, you are still okay. However, IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, composed of more than 4,000 experts around the globe, they already warned very seriously that we are in the middle of climate crisis and the climate catastrophe is just around the corner if we do not take revolutionary actions with strong sense of urgency. And climate change is directly linked to the poverty, humanitarian crisis, and conflicts. I would like to explain why further. Therefore, I believe that climate action, strong climate action must be mainstreamed in all humanitarian development operations, and also climate change must be an integral part of all governmental policies and decision making, and also climate change must be a major consideration for all humanitarian and development operations actors. We all know that 1.5 degrees Celsius ambition is something we must achieve by the end of this century, because IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they already warned that the global community must limit the average increase of global temperature within 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. If the global community fails to meet this target, then nature is going to so-called revenge. So Mr. Secretary, the former UN Secretary General, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, this is the phrase he frequently mentions in his speech. God forgives human beings. Human beings sometimes forgives human beings, but nature never forgives. So, because nature never forgives, we have to act right now. So in order to achieve the 1.5 degrees Celsius target by the end of this century, the experts already emphasized that by the middle of this century, around 2050, global community must achieve carbon neutrality. That's why at Glasgow UN Climate Change Conference at the end of last year, more than 100 countries, they committed to achieve 2050 carbon neutrality. Even China and India, they also declared that they will achieve carbon neutrality by 2060 or by 2070. If we fail to achieve this target, then nature is going to revenge to the human society. We are now witnessing the wildfires, extreme weather events like very hot summer, and huge super typhoons, floodings, droughts. I mean, many extreme weather events are warning to the global community that nature is getting angry. So those natural disasters due to climate crisis actually are becoming a main cause of extreme poverty. Just imagine the case of Pakistan. More than 1,300 people died, and more than 30% of the national territory is being flooded. And then it will take at least 5 years for Pakistan to restore their economy. So extreme poverty will be there, disease will be there, and humanitarian crisis will be there. Therefore, if we do not act, we do not address aggressively the climate change issue, so-called climate crisis issue, then the humanity is going to face the extreme poverty, humanitarian crisis, and poverty is bringing about conflict as well. Actually, Colleen from WFP, she mentioned that hunger drives conflict and conflict feeds hunger. In addition, I would like to say that climate crisis drives hunger and conflict. And when climate crisis will bring about extreme poverty as well. I was in Senegal, one of the small countries in West Africa. So, and I also covered 5 neighboring countries of Senegal. In those countries, their main industries are agriculture, which is directly hit by climate crisis. Therefore, when extreme weather events happen, the whole economy is going to be severely influenced. And when there is no food, you cannot expect that human rights will be promoted. When family is extremely poor, you cannot expect that the girls and boys of the children of the family will go to school. Therefore, climate crisis is, I want to repeatedly say that climate crisis must be a main consideration factor of all humanitarian development and peace activities. And finally, this morning, the Global Green Growth Institute, which is an intergovernmental organization to support developing countries' green growth, organized a session about green ODA. And panelists in that session, we agreed that there is no distinction between green ODA and non-green ODA. There must be no such a thing like non-green ODA, because ODA, or development cooperation, must be green. Green must be an integral factor in all development cooperations. So, Ambassador Cho, I think I must stop here, and then I'm happy to have further discussions.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ambassador. Because I believe you are ambassador for climate change, so that must be the reason why you just focus on just one topic on climate change, climate catastrophe, climate crisis. Thank you so much. And I think we will have a discussion for about 30 minutes. And I would like to have 3 different types of the discussion combination. One is a question and comments from the on-site comments, and then we also have the participants, audience, on here, and also the discussion between our panel members. So I think we can move on to these 3 different types of discussions and the comments session as the hybrid or mixture format. So I have received from the online participants one question. So let me start with this question from online audience. This is a question directed to Ms. Fleischer. And the question is this: I have questions about WFP operations in conflict areas, as I think based on the overview of the food insecurity, in case of areas under internal conflicts, isn't it hard to provide humanitarian assistance to the general public, including food assistance?
I think you're talking about the ability to have access to all the people and to ensure that food is not used as a weapon of war. I assume that this is the question. This is difficult in many countries, and you can, just think of Ukraine, you can think of Syria, where humanitarian assistance and the UN and the humanitarian actors have fought over years to ensure that we have access, equal way, to all the people living in the different areas under different control. I mean, I have led myself in Syria, convoys to a camp at the Jordanian border where you have to go through ISIS area or ex-ISIS area, with escorts provided by Russia. You have to go through territory that, is under another party's control. So very, very difficult. But we clearly, as WFP, we make, whatever we can that this happens. And as soon as we see, and we did this in Syria, as soon as we see that food is taken for other purposes or is taken away from going to the beneficiaries that have been identified, we stop assistance. We stop it, we negotiate, We clarify, and once we are sure that this is solved, then we resume the assistance. But, we're providing assistance to 140 million people, and in many contexts, it is very, very difficult to achieve that and to make sure that every grain goes to the right person. But we clearly have our systems in place to make sure that this happens to the extent possible.
Okay, thank you very much. Any additional comments or questions from the panel members on this topic?
I have a comment and a question. I'm speaking from my experience. When I served as the chairperson of the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, I've been to many countries in conflict and countries suffering. Actually, they've already entered climate catastrophe, countries like Vanuatu, where sea level is rising and agriculture is no longer an option. And then I have experience with Myanmar, where now there's 40% of the population are now living under poverty line. And the World Bank says this is the first time in 15 years. The people in Myanmar currently, the civilians, are giving up a meal a day so that they have enough, because there's not much food to go around. Prices have skyrocketed. But delivering food relief in Myanmar does harm sometimes. And there is a principle of do no harm in the UN entities' work. But there's a lot of harm when convoys, accompanied by the junta, travel to the small towns and villages. So how do you do your work in countries like this, in situations like this? I've seen that many people have suffered because of the UN entities having one mandate cannot cooperate with other mandates, which the HDP Nexus is actually calling for. Without a complete overhaul in the system, delivering aid to the most needed without doing any harm would be a very big challenge.
Thank you. Ambassador?
If I may add, I think Ms. Fleischer pointed out an important issue, because in addition to attacks on humanitarian aid workers, aid stealing is a serious issue these days. So for example, armed groups attack humanitarian workers because they are easy targets. They are soft targets. They are not armed, piece of cake. And if they are able to attack and steal aid workers who are delivering food, they can even, take some advantage of the food they steal. So this will make them another easy target. Not only easy, but profitable target. So aid stealing, I think, is becoming a very serious issue these days, and countries need to join force and use their collective wisdom to prevent these bad things from happening, like attacks on humanitarian aid workers and aid stealing as well.
Thank you very much. Yes, please.
Can I just add something to this? And we feel it in places where there is a bit of a diplomatic vacuum, certainly, like in Syria and other places where, and you're all ambassadors, or previous ambassadors. So oftentimes these negotiations are left to the United Nations and to the NGOs on the ground because governments do not send their diplomats to these places. And I think this is where we feel oftentimes, the pressure for not being able to have the help from the political side to ensure that we actually have access, that we have security, and that we can go to all sites where people are hungry or need assistance.
Thank you very much. The discussion, your comments reminds me that 3 years ago, before COVID, I attended the offline conference in New York on the development high-level meeting, and for 1 week, the one phrase I heard 100 times is shrinking space of civic space, the civil society's space. And now it's quite alarming that, as Ambassador O pointed out, the space for these activists, workers, organizations who are working at the field, the space is shrinking also. This is quite alarming situation. And we will have, now let me open the floor, and I would like to take questions and comments from on-site audience, 1 or 2 questions, and then we will move on to the discussion. Yes, please.
Now it's on, yes. Thank you very much to the panelists and also the chair. My name is Mahamadou Tunkara. I work for the Global Green Growth Institute, GGI, as director of one of the 4 divisions. As Ambassador Kim referred to, GGI works very closely on greening the ODA and the delivery. I have a comment and also a question, and asking for each one of the panelists to reflect on it. The first time I came across what I call the sustainability crisis, building on what Ambassador Kim referred to as climate crisis, we are facing a sustainability crisis. That first time was back in early 2000 when I was visiting the refugee camps in Quetta, in Afghanistan, at the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. I was regional director for another organization based in Bangkok. At that time, we were talking about sustainability crisis. We were talking about issues on shrinking NGOs or civil society organizations. But the reason I want to make this comment and ask you to reflect on is that for 2 reasons. The first one is sometimes we hear in discussions that, and I worked for a humanitarian organization before, when you have emergency response, it comes after the emergency. But not much effort is put on preventing the prevention work. So the pre-emergency efforts and the post-emergency efforts. When the camera is gone, what's happened? We forget, we move on to the next emergency. So the reflection that I'm asking from the panelists here is that how do we address in a holistic way, not focusing only on one component, the emergency part is one, but preventing that part is not only political, it's not only financial, it has different factors, but also linking to the long-term development aspect, so that we don't get into that cycle of always coming and handing foods, handing grains, but how do we build that resilience in a process that helps people to actually build the capacity to respond to the shocks. Many of these countries, whether it's LDCs or small island states, the safety nets are almost inexistent. When there are shocks, you see you have double-digit people falling under poverty line. So that's where I want the panelists, I'm asking the panelists your thought and reflection. The conversation has started, but earlier today Ambassador Kim mentioned, we don't have enough time. Time is the only thing we don't have. How can we accelerate on delivering on what is promised, but also stepping up on the result in a way that we don't have the compartmentalization of interventions, emergency support, and then another emergency hits, the cameras are gone, we move on to that. That's one comment that when I was doing the same work, we hear it many times, and it's happening. But how do we link it to the post-emergency? How do we build the resilience so that it also means partnership? But your reflections will be very much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And how can we accelerate this process? Who would like to start? Yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Mamadou. Actually, he's my previous colleague. So thank you very much for raising very important issue. I would like to focus on the term of prevention. You mentioned the importance of prevention. Of course, the humanitarian actions after the crisis then must be quick and effective. However, if we prevent something in advance, that will be much better. Therefore, I think most climate actions, why experts, they keep repeatedly saying the importance of strong climate action. I think that's mainly the prevention of worst consequences that humankind will face in the future. In order to build effective preventive measures, Mamadou, you mentioned the importance of a holistic approach. Taking into account that point, I'd like to emphasize two things. Number one is the role of government, good governance, and number two is the capacity of local communities. So, number one, about good governance. The government must be the main player to take preventive actions. So that's why I think many international organizations, even civil society organizations, they are helping developing or least developed countries' governments to make good policies and rules and regulations. Therefore, that's why many international organizations, financial organizations are providing policy advisory services to the government and also capacity building assistance to government officials of a country which has very weak capacity to handle crisis. But the role of government, the action of government is not enough either. We all know that. Particularly based on my experience in Senegal, I see the strong significance of local community leaders. Whatever decision whatever policy government is taking, actually the implementation is happening on the ground, in the field, and the key players are local community leaders, and many like women and the local, the village chiefs, and also young people in the village as well. So more and more we need to provide assistance to build the capacity of local community players. So, because they are the ones who can really make change happen in the field. That's why when I was in Global Green Growth Institute as the Deputy Director General, the Global Green Growth Institute focused not only helping governments of developing countries, but also local government leaders and community leaders. So sometimes in a project we supported capacity building of even a small village, municipality leaders as well. So when government, the so-called developed countries and international organizations are designing development cooperation projects and programs, how to nurture, how to build the capacity of local community must be a critical part to be considered. I must stop here. Thank you.
Okay, proceed. Yes.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that very pertinent question. When we talked about disaster management, we were focusing on disaster preparedness and how to respond. But you've all said the prevention is key. Now, what should be included in the prevention? It's easy to say identify the root causes. But how do you go about identifying the root causes when you don't have a resilient community or an institution that is built in order to withhold all pressures? People don't talk about child poverty as much. People think of poverty as income poverty. But child poverty is much more than income poverty. Child poverty is when there is lack or limited access to services. And so when you're wiping out a whole generation, for whatever means, is it due to conflict or is it due to a disaster, and you don't build that capacity and you don't identify it in a program beforehand, then this child will grow up in a much worse condition than their parents have. And when you say a holistic approach, and I said this in my intervention, this would be a rights-based approach. Where in many discourse we hear about putting people at the center, not just put the people at the center, but put their rights at the center from a rights-based approach programming. I've witnessed many UN agencies or humanitarian workers, but let me focus on the UN entities first. Their work is very crucial, but much of their work is their own mandate focused. And they're so removed from the people. I'm sorry about WFP or others, how much food, how many grams of grain did we deliver, how much outreach? But that's a very important thing, but we can do much more. We can say, we can build the capacity of the recipient, of the families. How do you store the grain? How do you cook the grain so that you can make better use and benefit more? Vaccines too, people who are involved in administering vaccines, they say how many outreach, how many people were we able to get in the arms, how many vaccines were we able to deliver. But let's talk about building, empowering the parent, empowering the sibling, empowering the family on what to look for, what signs to look for. I think that would be what I would say a holistic, but in my human rights terminology, I would say a rights-based approach. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any further comments from the panel? Or yes,
Well,
please.
Just to add, maybe, you know, Ambassador Kim, what you said about, you know, good governments and communities. We have a number of governments that are either not there, they're caretaker governments, or we have governments that are regimes and are not supported by the international you know, community and by funding and bilateral funding and so forth. So, so I agree with you, but in those places, clearly what you're saying, the communities are the ones we have to focus on. And you know, work with them to understand what their needs are, and then address those needs in a longer term, with a longer term view. And of course, you know, you referred to these food systems and, you know, smallholder farmers is really, I referred to it in my opening remarks, that 80% of the food is produced by smallholder farmers. And if we support them to, you know, to sustain their production, improve their production, have, better storage facilities. And this is a work that, many of us, and definitely the World Food Programme, works very much on. And now, more and more also with climate smart projects. But, in a world where people are now hungry, 5 countries have famine-like conditions, the question also is, where is donor money going in these projects? For the World Food Programme, and we struggle with this, and we talk with our donors all the time, is that, yes, of course we need to save those lives. That's very, very important. But we cannot, just stay there. We need to look at the longer term with the food systems. But of course, in a question of, in a time when money is short, it's also an ethical question, where do you put your money first?
Thank you very much. I have another question from online audience. And before I move on to this question, I would like to open the floor. Yes, please.
안녕하세요. 저는 정치외 기업.
So good. So I am from Jeju University. I'm a student. My name is Kim Seung-min. So Professor Lee mentioned that funding is very important. So when it comes to Korean ODA, the percentage is lower than 0.7% defined by OECD. It's less than 0.3% in Korea. So how should we be funding in the future? And the moderator has mentioned the civil society has shrinked. Actually, other institutions lack transparency. Maybe there's a lack of transparency of funds. And it's not only me, right? So when it comes to these issues, transparency, how to raise transparency, that's my next question. And also, Ambassador Oh was at the UN. You mentioned Myanmar, Senegal. What about North Korea? From a humanitarian point of view, in Korea, we think about unification. There has to be humanitarian aid to DPRK. So when it comes to Korea, we have some kind of hostile. We are kind of hostile against DPRK. So how can we do a humanitarian dialogue about the DPRK?
You have, there's 3 different questions. So I would like to give, who would like to start first? Because there's 3 different questions. I think Ambassador, yeah, please.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the question. Well, the ODA, ODA GNI ratio, as he pointed out, we are far from 0.7%, not even 0.2%, I think. We have to make more efforts. But the volume itself is increasing, so we have a long way to go. But if you want to look at the brighter side, these days, financing for development is not necessarily coming from ODA only. It's not necessarily coming from government only, A lot of other sectors like civil society, charity organizations, and corporate sector. For example, Save the Children International, there are 30 Save the Children countries in the world, and the money they put up, the contribution they collect annually is about the same level as South Korea's ODA volume. And Save the Children is not the largest civil society organization. There are bigger ones. So, and South Korea is not a small country when it comes to ODA. I think we stand around 15th or 16th. So that means what? That means a lot of money is coming from civil society and corporate sector in addition to government funding for development. So that's one thing we need to think about. And about the shrinking space for civil society, I think what Ambassador Joe meant was civil society's space might be shrinking, not necessarily because there's not enough funding. You know, in some cases, there is very good funding, as I pointed out, but especially in the era of pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, the government control, the government role, for example, quarantine, is expanding, is strengthening very fast. And if government control, increases, then as a response, naturally, logically, the space for civil society has to shrink. Because if civil society in each country can communicate and exchange without borders, then as a whole, globally, civil society's role will increase. But unfortunately, it's the other way around these days. So civil society space might be shrinking, but I think in the future, I hope we will go back to normalcy. And transparency issue you mentioned is important, but I think these days many civil society organizations are transparent enough. And it's not just a matter of funding these days. Lastly, North Korea. So when it comes to North Korea, as you know, under the current international sanctions, we are not able to provide development assistance to North Korea. We can only do that for humanitarian assistance. But as I pointed out during my presentation, nowadays, the distinction between humanitarian assistance and development assistance is getting blurred, not too clear these days. Because, for example, humanitarian assistance is responding to humanitarian crisis. But if you think about it, crisis, if we have a crisis that is going on for 10 years in Syria the war is going on for 10 years. So it was crisis in the beginning. But can you still call it a crisis if crisis is going on 10 years? So humanitarian assistance, which is supposed to respond to humanitarian crisis, it still has its role, but as I said, there are so many emergencies and so many crises that are going on. And, someone once used the term banality of evil. Now I should use the term banality of crisis. So when crisis becomes banal, it's very difficult. As pointed out by the gentleman from GGGI, we need a more holistic approach. Maybe at one point, there might be no need for, distinguishing humanitarian work from development assistance work.
Thank you very much.
If
Professor
I may
Lee?
add, thank you for the question of ODA funding. I have to remind the audience that during the time of the financial global crisis, some of the Scandinavian countries actually increased their ODA to 1% from 0.75%. So it's doable. And I think in our country, South Korea, there needs to be a lot more awareness raising about the importance of an ODA. And also ODA is controlled, I think, by the National Assembly. You have to get parliamentarian approval for ODA. And our lawmakers are not that easy to pass an ODA above, from now less than 3%, 2.25 maybe something, to 4% or 5% overnight. DPRK, I fully agree with Ambassador Oh. And the humanitarian need is so many, and they come in droves and in short spaces of time. And there's a limited amount of funding, and so where do you put your money in which is more chronic, which is more acute? Do we invest in more chronic places? And I think this is why I said the changing approach should be a more of a longer term approach. Maybe we should use a different word than a humanitarian. Maybe we should use a word that might say human needs-based or human rights-based assistance. And regardless of what happens, I think North Korea, it's a very chronic situation, but we do need to provide them with some humanitarian assistance continuously. And that comes in food, that comes in form of medicines, vaccinations, commodities for families. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Kim?
Because I'm the only one working in Korean government right now, I must respond to the question of the gentleman regarding the Korean ODA. Yes, still Korean ODA is far from the target of 0.7% of GDP. However, I would like to, in addition to what Ambassador Oh just mentioned, Korean ODA is constantly increasing. So that's an important factor to be considered. And even during the term of economic downturn, Korea has constantly increased the ratio and volume of ODA. That's why many other countries and intergovernmental organizations, UN agencies appreciate Korea's contribution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Since we have 3 minutes left, I would like to ask if there's any further questions from the speakers, then I would like to close the session. Any further comments? Or my space has shrunken because Ambassador Oh and Ambassador Kim has mentioned all these 3 topics. I would like to, for the civil society's the perspective, the shrinking civic space, I have something that I should mention, but Ambassador Oh has covered, so my space has shrunken already. So, I would like to thank, first of all, the distinguished 4 speakers for their really informative and very useful presentation and discussion today. And I would like to also thank the participants from online and offline for their contribution to this very constructive discussion today. I believe we live in a fragile world because of the 2 different disasters, as Professor Lee mentioned, the man-made disasters and also natural disasters. And I believe also we live in a very fast-changing world. Because we are living in a fast-changing world, I believe we need constant upon which we can depend on like a rock. I believe our collective commitment and political will to cope with this humanitarian crisis can be a constant and rock upon which we can depend. Once again, thank you so much, and I would like to close the session. Thank you so much for all the participants and panelists. Thank you very much also for the Jeju Forum and WFP and staff and 윤선희 소장님. Thank you very much. 감사합니다.
그럼 이것으로 세션을 마치겠습니다. 잠시 휴식 시간을 가진 뒤 계속해서 다음 세션이 진행될 예정이오니 많은 참여 부탁드립니다. 감사합니다.
Thank you all for such remarkable talks. Then, this concludes our session. After having 30 minutes break, we will come back to another session. We would like to ask for your continuous support and interest. Thank you.